You don't touch the flag. The words cut through the chaos of the Washington airport like a blade. An airport manager's hand hovered inches from the stars and stripes draped over a soldier's casket. Travelers froze mid-step, phones lowered. What they thought was just another delay was about to become a moment that no one would ever forget. At the heart of it stood a tomb guard, silent, disciplined, unyielding, protecting a fallen brother. What happened next would divide the terminal, force strangers to choose sides and remind a nation of the cost of its freedom. Follow my story to the end and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story has reached. The sound of rolling suitcases, clattering heels, and muffled announcements filled the concourse like a steady drumbeat. Screens flashed with destinations: Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas. But for Sergeant Michael Carter, none of it mattered. His eyes never wavered from the casket draped in the American flag, now resting solemnly at the edge of the arrivals hall. The fabric rippled under the blast of cold air from the sliding doors. The stars and stripes gleamed perfect, each fold pressed with the reverence of a century of tradition. Michael stood beside it, white-gloved hands clasped at his waist, his uniform crisp and unyielding. The badge on his chest, a tomb guard's badge, glimmered under fluorescent light. To most of the crowd, he was just another soldier. To those who knew, that badge was rarer than any medal of valor, worn only by those who guarded America's most sacred ground. But Michael wasn't here for recognition. He was here because of a promise. 3 days ago, in a dim office overseas, he'd received the folded letter with words that carved into his chest like shrapnel. Private First Class Ethan Ward killed in action. Ethan, the kid with a crooked smile, the one who carried crayon drawings from his daughter in his helmet, the one who'd once pulled Michael from the dirt of Afghanistan, saving his life. The same Ethan who, on their last night together, had said, "If I don't make it back, promise me this bring me home through the front. No back hallways. No shortcuts. Full honors." Now that promise was all that kept Michael steady. He could still see Ethan's grin in the firelight, hear him say, "You think too much, Mike. Sometimes you just gotta feel it." He could still smell the dust, taste the grit of sand and smoke. Ethan wasn't supposed to be gone. Yet here he was back in America, but silent, covered by the one flag that bound them both. Michael drew a slow breath, steadying the storm within. His job was clear escort Ethan through the terminal. Let the people see him, let them understand the cost etched in that flag. But already trouble stirred. Across the terminal, a tall man in a tailored gray suit strode forward, his jaw tight, a clipboard clutched like a weapon. Richard Collins, operations manager, moved with the urgency of a man who measured time in seconds and disruptions in dollars. His eyes swept over the honor guard assembling the casket, and finally Michael. His lips pressed into a thin line. "This won't do," Collins muttered, his voice carrying just enough to reach his assistant Sarah, who trailed behind. "We're at peak departures, 20 flights in the next hour. We can't shut down half the concourse for this." Sarah hesitated, her gaze flicking to the casket. "Sir, the airport director approved the main route." Collins stopped short, turning sharply on her. "The service corridors are there for a reason. Quiet, efficient. No disruption. Get it rerouted." Michael's head turned slightly, his eyes narrowing. He didn't speak, not yet, but the tension in his jaw betrayed that he'd heard. His grip on his gloves tightened. The crowd began to gather, travelers, slowing, children tugging at parents' sleeves. Phones lifted, catching the sight of the soldier standing guard. A whisper rippled through the air. "Who is he? What's happening?" Near the front, a woman with silver hair clutched the hand of a little girl. Helen Ward's face bore the years of service as an Army nurse and the grief of a mother burying her son. Beside her, 10-year-old Lily's eyes widened, fixed on the casket. Grandma Lily whispered, tugging Helen's hand. "Is that Daddy's plane?" Helen's throat closed. She nodded, tears brimming, but no words came. Michael saw them. His chest ached, but his face remained carved from stone. He thought of Ethan's voice the night before their final mission. "If I don't come back, make sure Mom knows I wanted it this way. Make sure Lily sees me come home right." That promise burned brighter now, especially with Helen and Lily watching. Collins advanced, his polished shoes clicking like a metronome of defiance. He raised his clipboard, tapping it against his palm. "Sergeant, He called out, his tone sharp. We've prepared an alternative route. The service corridors will take you directly to the loading area. Much more efficient. Michael turned his head slowly, his voice steady, deep, carrying the weight of Arlington itself. Private First Class Ethan Ward will proceed through the main terminal. As arranged. As required. Collins' eyes narrowed. I understand your sentiment, Sergeant, but this isn't about symbolism. This is about thousands of passengers whose schedules will be disrupted. We can't have delays ripple through the system. Michael's gaze hardened. This is not symbolism. This is honor. The air seemed to thin. The nearby crowd leaned in. Collins stepped closer, lowering his voice as if that might soften the steel in Michael's stance. Sergeant, be reasonable. No one will know the difference if he goes through the service corridor. It's faster. Michael's words came like a verdict. Everyone will know, especially his family, especially his brothers in arms. Hiding him in a back hallway is not faster. It's shameful. Sarah shifted uneasily, her hand brushing the radio at her side. Travelers glanced between the two men, sensing the clash. Somewhere, a child asked, "Why won't they let him through?" Collins pressed on, jaw tight. Sergeant, I am responsible for this terminal. Efficiency comes first. Michael took a single step forward, closing the space between them. His voice dropped, but every syllable rang with unshakable authority. There are duties older than your airport, protocols older than your position. Ethan Ward died serving his country. He will not be hidden in death. The crowd went silent, phones lowered. Even the overhead announcement paused as if the terminal itself held its breath. Then Collins did the one thing no one expected. He reached out his hand, brushing the edge of the flag. Michael's reaction was instant. His gloved hand snapped forward, gripping Collins' wrist with firm, measured force. His eyes locked on the man's, his words low, unwavering. You don't touch the flag. The words weren't loud, but they carried like thunder through the hushed concourse. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Veterans straightened, parents pulled children closer, and Helen Ward's hand flew to her mouth. Michael held Collins' wrist for 3 heartbeats, then released it, his face impassive, but his eyes blazing with restrained fury. The moment had shifted. No one in that terminal would ever forget it. The silence that followed Michael's words weighed heavier than the roar of any jet engine. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if the entire terminal, the lights, the polished tiles, even the departure screens had frozen in place. Collins recoiled, rubbing his wrist, his face pale with shock but quickly darkening with indignation. Yet Michael's posture never wavered. His arms returned to his sides, his white gloves steady, his eyes fixed forward as though carved from stone. The casket at his side seemed to radiate its own gravity, drawing the gaze of every onlooker. The flag shimmered faintly beneath the airport's artificial light, an anchor of solemnity in a sea of anxious travelers. For Michael Carter, this wasn't just a moment of defiance. It was the continuation of a vow etched into his bones. His mind drifted unbidden back to Arlington, to the quiet rhythm of duty that had defined him. He remembered the first time he walked the marble steps leading to the tomb of the unknown soldier. The silence there wasn't empty. It was alive, charged, demanding reverence. Every recruit who trained for the old guard learned the ritual's 21 steps, 21 seconds, flawless turns, precision beyond the human eye. But for Michael, it was more than ritual. It was a covenant with the fallen, with history, with every nameless soldier whose sacrifice deserved to echo through eternity. The badge on his chest had not come cheaply. He could still feel the blistered feet from endless drills, the strain of holding a rifle motionless under the blazing sun or biting winter winds. He could still hear his instructor's voice, clipped and relentless. Perfection is the minimum. These men and women gave their lives. You will give them your best. It was during those long nights on silent guard that Michael's friendship with Ethan had grown into something deeper than camaraderie. He could still see Ethan leaning against a Humvee under the desert stars, grinning like mischief itself. You ever stop thinking Mike Ethan had said one night, tossing a pebble into the dust? You carry the whole world on your shoulders. You gotta learn to just feel it. Michael had smirked, shaking his head. Somebody's gotta keep you alive, Ethan. You're chaos. I'm the compass. Ethan had laughed then, that unrestrained, reckless laugh that cut through the tension of the war like a lifeline. Later, after too many close calls, that laughter became Michael's anchor. In the darkest moments, he'd remind himself, if Ethan can laugh, maybe we'll survive this. And then came the ambush. Michael had replayed it 1,000 times in his head. The sudden rattle of gunfire, the eruption of sand and fire. He'd been too slow that night, just 1 second behind. But Ethan hadn't hesitated. On your left, Mike, Ethan had shouted, slamming into him, knocking him down as a spray of bullets cut the air where Michael's head had been. They'd hit the dirt together, hearts pounding. Michael remembered the ringing in his ears, the searing heat of adrenaline. Ethan, bleeding from his shoulder, had grinned through the pain. That's what brothers do. It was later, under a desert moon, when Ethan's voice had shifted from laughter to gravity. If anything happens to me, Mike, promise me. Don't let them sneak me out the back. Bring me through the front where people can see. My dad always said a soldier deserves to be seen. Michael had locked eyes with him. I promise. That promise bound him now here in this terminal where time seemed to have stopped. Across the hall, Helen Ward's breath came shallow as she watched the confrontation unfold. The lines on her face told stories of battles fought in hospitals and field tents of soldiers lost of wounds that never healed. She'd spent a lifetime patching up others, but nothing had prepared her for this moment, seeing her son return not in triumph, but in silence beneath the flag. Beside her, Lily's small voice broke through the stillness. Grandma, why is that man trying to move? Daddy. Helen tightened her grip on her granddaughter's hand. Because some people don't understand, sweetheart. But that soldier, she nodded toward Michael. He does. He'll protect your daddy's honor. Lily's wide eyes flickered to Michael. To her, he looked like a statue, untouchable, a hero out of one of her father's stories. She pressed her crayon drawing tighter against her chest, the one she had made for her dad weeks before. Meanwhile, Collins tried to reclaim control. He straightened his suit, forcing composure back into his voice. Sergeant, he said sharply, this display is unnecessary. We have protocols to maintain. You are jeopardizing airport operations. Michael's reply was quiet but immovable. You call it a display. I call it duty. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Some nodded, others exchanged glances. A man in a Marine Corps cap stepped closer, his weathered face solemn. I lost brothers in Vietnam, he said, his voice steady despite age. They never came home. Don't you dare send this one through a back hallway. The words struck the crowd like a spark. Travelers who moments ago had been impatient now stood straighter, watching with a reverence they hadn't expected to feel inside an airport. A mother hushed her son. A businessman closed his laptop. A teenage girl slipped her phone back into her pocket, tears forming. Michael felt the shift, but he remained still, his expression composed. He wasn't here to inspire a crowd, he was here to keep a promise. Collins bristled, but for the first time his voice wavered. We can't delay thousands of passengers for one man. Helen stepped forward, then her voice trembling yet strong. That one man is my son. He gave his life so thousands could keep theirs. And you want to hide him like an inconvenience. Lily's small voice echoed hers, piercing and innocent. That's Daddy's flag. Don't hide, Daddy. The terminal grew even quieter. Collins's shoulders slumped just slightly, his confidence cracking under the weight of grief made human tangible. Michael's gaze shifted briefly toward Helen and Lily. Their pain was his compass, as real as Ethan's voice had been that night under the desert stars. He turned back to Collins, his words final. We walk through the main terminal. That is non-negotiable. For the first time, Collins had no immediate reply. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted to the growing crowd, to the veterans saluting, to the children staring wide-eyed to the flag itself. He was losing control. Michael stood unshaken, a sentinel in scarlet and black, guarding not just a fallen comrade, but the very meaning of the promise they'd shared. And as the honor guard prepared to lift the casket, the air in the terminal thickened with something Collins couldn't measure on a clipboard reverence. The honor guard's boots struck the polished floor in a cadence that thinned the terminal's noise to a hush. Each step was deliberate, a metronome of respect that made even the scrolling flightboard seem to slow. The casket rested for the moment, the bearers waiting on Sergeant Michael Carter's nod. He fixed his gaze just above the flag's top edge, the place he'd learned to look so his eyes wouldn't betray the storm inside. Across the rope line, Helen Ward squeezed Lily's hand until the girl glanced up. "You okay?" she asked softly. Lily nodded without letting go. "Is he cold in there?" Helen's mouth trembled. "He doesn't feel cold now, baby." Lily shifted the paper she had been guarding all morning. "I brought the drawing." She unfolded it carefully, a plane, a smiling stick figure in uniform, a smaller one with pigtails, and a huge flag filling the sky. In the corner, purple letters leaned, "Daddy, love, Lily." Helen smoothed a crease with her thumb. He'd liked that she whispered, eyes flicking toward Michael, the soldier who had stood like a wall when everything else felt like water. On the periphery of the crowd, operations manager Richard Collins paced his phone pressed to his ear. "We're at risk of cascading delays," he muttered. "Authorize reroute through service corridors quietly." He stopped, jaw tightening, as the answer came. He ended the call unsatisfied. His assistant, Sarah Martinez, stood half a step away. Radio silent gaze fixed on the flag. "People are forming up on their own," she said quietly. Collins turned, irritation flashing. But then he saw it, travelers edging back from the central walkway, creating space without being told. A deadheading pilot stepped aside and squared his shoulders. A flight attendant set down her roller bag and clasped the hand of a small boy who had asked why everyone looked serious, and a man in a faded USMC cap. George Roberts stood stiff with palm against his brim shoulders, straight as a memory. Collins frowned. "We can't lose control to a spectacle." Sarah's eyes didn't leave the casket. "This isn't a spectacle." Michael lifted his chin and gave a slight nod to the bearers. The casket rose on 6 synchronized breaths. The flag fluttered, faintly, stars shivering under the airport's lights. "Daddy said flags have to be folded." "Perfect," Lily whispered. Helen's eyes blurred with a memory Ethan on their porch in spring light, showing Lily how to fold a small cotton flag. "Keep your hands clean," he told her. "Never let it touch the ground. Folding it right is like promising to be your best." The memory cracked Helen's chest wide open, but she held steady. Heel-toe lift, the honor guard stepped. The sound turned the concourse into a hymn. Conversations died. Phones lowered. A TSA supervisor at the checkpoint leaned from his podium, removed his cap, and bowed his head. Even the automated voice announcing a gate change seemed to pause, as if the building itself understood. Michael's senses sharpened as they had on patrols. He registered the faint citrus sting of a cleaning solvent, the rasp of a suitcase wheel with a bent axle, the harsh, shallow breaths of the manager to his left. He measured the distance to the doors, plotted pauses, and calculated spacing. Duty had a mathematics to it. So did promises. An airline worker rushed forward with paperwork, froze at the sight of the flag, then stepped back, waiting. Impatience caged by respect. Little choices, Michael thought, make big promises visible. Colin shoved his phone into his pocket and barked, "Security! Help me open a lane to service." His voice carried just enough to reach Michael. Sarah didn't budge. "Sir, with respect, he's not a cart. He's a casket," Collins snapped, "and you have a job." Before Sarah could answer, George Roberts spoke calm and steady. "We all have a job." Collins met the older man's eyes, expecting anger. He found something worse for his argument, patience. "You don't run this airport." "No," George said, voice low but resonant. "I just remember what it looks like when we forget what matters." Michael signaled for the guard to halt midway down the concourse. The bearers lowered the casket to the carriage for a brief pause. Michael stepped forward one pace, white gloves folded, standing sentinel, so the people could see a soldier still kept watch. Helen drifted closer, the rope line no match for grief. Michael's gaze flicked to her, then to Lily. He didn't smile, ceremony forbade it, but his eyes softened. He remembered Ethan in the chow line bragging about Lily's school drawings with so much pride it filled the barracks. "Can I give him this now?" Lily asked, holding the drawing high. "Not yet, sweetheart," Helen said, swallowing hard. "We'll put it with him when it's time." The hush pressed down heavier than silence. Someone sniffled. Somewhere a prayer unspooled without sound. Colin stepped forward again, voice pitched for command. "If this continues, families will miss flights. There will be medical connections at risk business meetings." Helen turned on him, her grief hardening to steel. Families are here. My family is here. Collins froze. For the first time, his eyes registered the truth standing in front of him, a woman whose posture bore years of service and a child clutching a crayon drawing instead of a teddy bear. He fumbled. Ma'am, I didn't mean— Helen cut him off with a small shake of her head. Just let him come home right, that's all. A uniformed police officer drifted near, hand loose at his belt, eyes finding Michael's. Backup was offered, but unnecessary. The true line of defense was already here, a corridor of ordinary citizens bound by silent reverence. The officer nodded once and stepped back. Michael angled his head toward Collins. You can help, he said evenly. Tell your people this path is open. Open, not blocked. It will be faster than fighting it. Collins bristled. Yet when he glanced around, he saw Sarah already directing travelers to the sides with simple gestures. Compliance came easily when offered with respect. The knot in his chest tightened. The bearers reset their grips. The casket rose again. Helen exhaled, nearly sobbing. Lily pressed closer. Grandma, did Daddy know this would happen? Helen's voice carried something deeper than bone. He knew what he asked Michael to do. He knew his friend would keep a promise. The next stretch of steps carried them by tall windows. Winter sunlight poured in, scattering across the flag until it seemed to glow. A toddler waved, then caught himself and put his hand over his heart. His mother mirrored him, tears in her eyes. Michael felt the shift. Resistance had given way to reverence. This was no longer a fight to justify the procession. It was a choice to walk with it. He pictured the last turn toward the doors, Ethan's voice teasing him, always planning Mike. Then that familiar laugh like a hand on his shoulder. A businessman in a rumpled suit murmured to no one in particular, I was going to complain. Then I saw her. He nodded toward Lily. I'll catch the next flight. George Roberts lowered his hand, flexing stiff fingers. From his pocket he pulled a ribbon frayed and bent from another war. He held it against his palm. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Collins shifted awkwardly, folding and unfolding his arms, nowhere to put his hands. He looked at Sarah, who met his eyes with calm certainty. For the first time he wondered if maybe he was the one out of step. Michael halted the guard once more at the wide intersection where chaos usually reigned. Today the space opened willingly. He stepped forward and let two words fall into the silence. Thank you. The words traveled in whispers up and down the corridor, multiplying like a prayer. Then the casket moved again. By the time they reached the terminal's final 100 feet, sunlight broke fully through the clouds. The flag blazed as if lit from within. Lily gasped. He sees us, she whispered. Helen's tears spilled. Maybe we finally see him. Michael didn't look at Collins again. He didn't need to. This was larger than any argument. It lived in the bowed heads, the hushed breaths, the simple decision of a crowd to honor sacrifice. The sliding doors yawned open. Cold air spilled in. Outside the hearse waited like a punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. Forward, Michael commanded. The honor guard obeyed, and the airport moved with them. The cold air from the open doors whispered across the concourse, curling around polished shoes and stiff uniforms. Sergeant Michael Carter's focus stayed locked on the flag-draped casket, but he could feel the shift behind him. The crowd of travelers had turned from restless strangers into a living guard of honor. Every breath seemed synchronized, every eye fixed on the flag. The transformation should have silenced even the most stubborn dissent. But Richard Collins, the operations manager, wasn't ready to surrender his authority. Collins' shoes clicked sharply against the tile as he stepped into Michael's path once more. His face was pale, but set in the grim mask of a bureaucrat convinced he still had ground to stand on. The clipboard in his hands was dented at the corner where his grip had grown too tight. Sergeant, he began, trying to pitch his voice low professional, but the strain made it sharp. I cannot allow this to continue. Our systems are already showing delays. Planes are waiting on tarmac clearance because this route is blocked. There are protocols. Michael didn't turn his head, didn't even blink. His voice emerged quiet, controlled. This is Private First Class Ethan Ward. He will go through the main concourse. The words landed heavier than any order Collins had ever given in his pristine office upstairs. His jaw clenched, but he pressed on. You're making a spectacle, Sergeant. There's a service elevator 30 yards away that would... The sudden steady voice of Sarah Martinez, his assistant, interrupted. Sir, look around you. Collins faltered, then followed her gaze. The concourse had transformed into a corridor of reverence. Passengers stood in neat lines along either side of the wide walkway, their luggage tucked away, their phones lowered. Even the loudspeaker that had just begun to announce a boarding call cut short as the airline employee at the gate muted her microphone with trembling fingers. They're waiting, Sarah said, her eyes steady. Not for a plane, for him. Collins felt a flush creep up his neck. He turned seeking an ally, but every set of eyes near him was on the casket, unflinching, unyielding. The authority he wielded in memos and meetings meant nothing here. Michael let the silence stretch before speaking again. Respect isn't a delay. The words stung Collins more than he expected. He tried to rally. This isn't your decision to make. It isn't yours either, came another voice. George Roberts, the Vietnam veteran, stepped forward again. His back was bent by age, but his presence filled the space. That flag belongs to all of us who wore the uniform. That casket belongs to his family. And this path, he gestured down the wide corridor toward the sunlight, belongs to honor. You don't get to reroute that. The crowd murmured in agreement. Collins swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how alone he stood. Michael's gaze flicked to Helen Ward, who clutched Lily's hand as though tethered by grief itself. She gave him a single nod. It was enough. Michael returned his eyes to the path ahead and spoke softly. Forward. The honor guard resumed their steps, steady boots striking the floor in solemn rhythm. Each movement carried the casket closer to the doors, closer to the hearse waiting outside. But Collins wasn't finished. He strode beside the guard, his voice rising in desperation. I'll have you removed if you don't comply. Security will... What Sarah's voice cracked louder now, startling even herself. Her radio remained untouched at her belt. Remove a tomb guard from his fallen brother. Force a grieving mother and daughter through a back corridor. No, sir, not today. Collins turned, stunned, but Sarah didn't flinch, her voice steadied. I won't give that order, not when the right path is clear. Michael allowed himself the smallest glance in her direction. A flicker of gratitude crossed his eyes before vanishing beneath his stone-like composure. The procession moved on. The flag glowed under shafts of winter sunlight slicing through the tall windows. Helen's steps slowed as she pulled Lily closer to the casket. The girl whispered, Can I touch it? Grandma, go. Helen's voice trembled. Not yet, sweetheart. Soon. Every head turned as Lily's words carried through the silence, reminding all that inside the coffin was not an idea, not a symbol, but a father. Collins fell back. His face flushed with a war he could not win. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then muttered to no one in particular, Schedules matter, but the words sounded hollow even to him. The bearers halted once more at Michael's command, positioning the casket near the final turn. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel drifting in from the open doors. Outside the hearse gleamed black against the bright tarmac. Michael lifted his chin and spoke, his voice carrying clearly. This is his path home. The crowd shifted closer, dozens of strangers now united in the same silent vow. A mother pulled her teenage son's cap from his head, pressing it to his chest. A businessman bowed awkwardly, ashamed of how quickly he'd nearly complained. A flight attendant slipped off her blazer, folding it carefully over her arm, in quiet respect. And through it all, Michael stood unwavering, a sentinel keeping his promise. The tension hadn't ended. Collins's pride still smoldered, his authority still itching for recognition, but the tide had turned. The airport was no longer his. For this moment it belonged to Private First Class Ethan Ward. The hearse outside gleamed beneath the winter sun, but the casket had not yet crossed the threshold. Sergeant Michael Carter ordered the honor guard to halt, his hand raised in a measured signal. He wasn't stalling for effect, he was guarding the pace, making sure every step of Ethan Ward's last walk home matched the gravity of the promise he had made. For a moment the pause gave way to silence, so pure it seemed to stretch across decades. Michael's eyes locked on the flag, but his mind drifted back to the desert. He could smell it, the iron tang of blood, the acrid smoke from spent rounds. He was back in Afghanistan, pinned down in a narrow valley where the moon lit up jagged rock and enemy fire cut through the night. He saw the flare of muzzle flashes, heard the thunderclap of rifles echoing through the canyon. And then he heard Ethan's voice, raw, urgent. "On your left, Mike." The next memory came like a blow. Ethan lunging, tackling him to the ground as tracer fire lit up the air where Michael had stood. Pain, dust, the weight of Ethan's body pressing him into the dirt. And then Ethan's laugh, absurd and reckless, even as blood seeped from his shoulder. "That's what brothers do," Ethan had said, brushing off Michael's frantic thanks. But Michael remembered the shadow in his friend's eyes afterward. The laughter had returned, but it was tempered a little quieter, as though Ethan had begun to feel the weight of the future pressing in. Later, under the pale desert stars, Ethan had grown serious. His voice carried not the swagger of a soldier, but the certainty of a man who knew time was short. "Mike, listen. If I don't come back one day, don't let them sneak me out the back. Promise me that. Full honors through the front, where people can see. My dad used to say the worst thing wasn't dying for your country. It was being forgotten." Michael had swallowed hard. "I promise." That vow, spoken in dust and blood, was why he stood here now, holding firm against every demand to take Ethan through a corridor meant for baggage carts. The crowd felt the weight of that unspoken memory in Michael's stance, though none of them knew the details. They only knew they were witnessing something too sacred to be rushed. Richard Collins, however, still couldn't see it. The operations manager adjusted his tie with jerky motions, frustration radiating from every stiff angle of his body. He stepped forward, his voice sharp enough to cut the hush. "Sergeant, this is absurd. These delays cost us thousands of dollars every minute. Protocols exist for efficiency. We can't hold up an international terminal because you feel sentimental about Michael's head turned just slightly, his gaze piercing enough to stop Collins mid-sentence. His voice came out calm but steel-lined. "This is not sentiment. This is duty, and you will not dishonor him." Collins bristled. "I am responsible for this terminal. You are out of line." Helen Ward's voice rose suddenly from the crowd. "No, you are." The grief-hardened mother stepped forward, pulling Lily with her. Her shoulders straightened her nurse's training, lending her the bearing of someone who had stood beside too many caskets. "That's my son in there. He fought so men like you could argue about schedules instead of bullets. Don't you dare treat him like cargo." Collins flinched. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Lily clutched her grandmother's hand tighter, her small voice breaking through the tension. "That's my daddy's flag. Please don't hide him." A collective shiver ran through the crowd. Strangers blinked back tears. A young woman in airline uniform pressed her hands together, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. Even George Roberts, the Vietnam veteran, lowered his head and saluted again. This time slower, his hand trembling. Michael's eyes softened as they flicked toward Lily. He remembered Ethan pulling a crayon drawing from his helmet, his face alight with pride. "My girl made this," he had said, smoothing it over the inside of his helmet. "Keeps me safe." That drawing had survived 3 tours. Ethan hadn't. "Forward," Michael said at last. His voice cut through grief and bureaucracy alike, commanding in its simplicity. The honor guard lifted the casket again, their movements synchronized like one living organism. The crowd leaned back respectfully, forming a wider corridor. But Collins, stubborn and desperate to reassert control, darted to the side. He signaled to 2 uniformed airport security officers who had just arrived. "Escort them to the service corridor," he ordered. The officers hesitated, their eyes falling on the casket, then on Michael. The weight of the flag seemed to freeze them in place. One officer murmured, "Sir, I don't think— do it. Do it." Collins snapped, his voice breaking under pressure. Sarah Martinez stepped forward, planting herself between Collins and the security team. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. "Sir, if you give that order, you'll disgrace yourself and this airport. That soldier goes through the front." Collins turned on her, stunned. "You're insubordinate." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm human." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Collins' face flushed red, the thin veneer of authority peeling away. He reached out almost in desperation and brushed the flag again. Michael moved instantly, seizing his wrist a second time. His voice dropped low, dangerous in its restraint. "I told you once. You don't touch the flag." This time Collins's legs wavered under the weight of shame. The crowd erupted not in shouts, but in a tidal silence heavier than condemnation. Their eyes bore down on him, judgment he couldn't escape. Michael released him slowly, his face still composed, but the finality in his words undeniable. "Stand aside." And for the first time, Collins did. The procession moved forward once more. The sound of the honor guard's boots carried like thunder through the stillness. The promise lived in every step. The honor guard advanced, their movements flawless, the flag glowing under slanting beams of winter sunlight. The crowd instinctively stepped back, forming a clean corridor, as if choreographed by something older than orders. Each footfall of the pallbearers echoed across the polished floors, a drumbeat steady enough to drown out the rolling wheels of suitcases and the murmurs of the terminal. For Sergeant Michael Carter, every step forward was a step back into memory. The tight grip of his gloves reminded him of the rifle he'd carried on post at Arlington, motionless for hours, refusing even to scratch an itch. He'd learned then that discipline was a language that silence and precision could speak louder than words. Here in the chaos of a public terminal, that same language transformed strangers into witnesses. Helen Ward clutched Lily close as they followed the casket's slow progress. The child's eyes tracked the stars on the flag wide with a mixture of pride and fear. Grandma Lily whispered, "Do you think Daddy knows we're here?" Helen's throat caught, but she steadied her voice. "I think he knows, sweetheart. I think he sees every step." The words rippled through the people nearest them. A businessman who had been checking his watch lowered his wrist, ashamed of his impatience. A teenage girl with earbuds pulled them out, her face flushing as tears slipped down. And George Roberts, the Vietnam veteran, drew in a long breath and saluted again, stiff but proud. Richard Collins trailed just behind his clipboard, hanging limp now at his side. His confidence had fractured, yet stubbornness still gnawed at him. His mind raced through metrics and timetables, but every glance at the crowd unsettled him further. They weren't passengers anymore, they were participants, and none of them were looking at him. Sergeant Collins tried again, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Think of the system. Think of the flights being held. This isn't sustainable." Michael didn't break stride. His reply was steady. "Honor is always sustainable." The words cut deep. Sarah Martinez, walking a few paces back, met Collins's eyes. "He's right," she said simply. The procession reached the wide intersection of gates where foot traffic usually tangled in impatient knots. Today, however, it was empty. Travelers had already shifted to the sides, forming a corridor as wide as a runway. On both flanks, people stood shoulder to shoulder, pilots, flight attendants, tourists with backpacks, families clutching children, all united in silence. Michael commanded a halt. The pallbearers froze, lowering the casket with practiced care. The flag caught the light, radiant as if it breathed. Michael took one pace forward, placing himself at the casket's head. The silence deepened so complete it felt alive. Then softly a voice broke through. "My son loved baseball," Helen said. Her voice was low, but it carried across the hush. "He wanted to be a pilot when he was Lily's age. He used to tell me, 'Mom, when I fly, you'll be the first passenger.'" Her lips trembled, but her spine held firm. Instead, he gave his wings for his squad. Lily, clutching the drawing, whispered, "Daddy said he'd always come back." And he did. The words pierced every heart within earshot. A woman in uniform swallowed back tears. A man lowered to one knee, bowing his head. The silence was no longer stillness, it was reverence. Collins's shoulders sagged. He felt the last shreds of his authority slip through his fingers. The efficiency awards on his office wall flashed in his mind, meaningless now. What had he been protecting? A schedule. Numbers on a screen. In front of him was sacrifice itself, wrapped in cloth that demanded awe. Michael turned slowly, his eyes sweeping over the crowd, then landing on Collins. His voice dropped low, each word a weight. "This moment is not yours to control. It belongs to him. It belongs to his family. It belongs to every soldier who never made it home." Collins' lips moved, but no sound came. Michael nodded once to the honor guard. The casket lifted again. The crowd leaned back in perfect symmetry, their line now unbroken from the security checkpoint all the way to the sliding doors. An airline worker abandoned his desk to join the formation. A mother hushed her restless toddler with a finger to her lips, and the child, sensing the gravity, fell silent. Then, without prompting, George Roberts's voice rang out, cracked, but clear. Eyes right. Instinctively, veterans in the crowd obeyed, snapping into salute. The gesture spread not perfect, not uniform, but powerful. Heads bowed, hands pressed over hearts. It was no longer an airport. It was holy ground. Collins stumbled back, the clipboard slipping from his grasp and clattering to the tile. No one looked at him. No one cared. Michael kept his eyes forward, but inside he felt Ethan's presence like a steady hand on his shoulder. "We made it, brother," he thought. "You're going home, right?" The procession turned the final corner toward the doors. Sunlight blazed across the floor, casting the flag in hues of fire and gold. Lily gasped softly. "Look, Grandma, it's like Daddy's flag is glowing." Helen nodded, tears spilling freely now. "That's because it carries more than cloth, Lily. It carries him." The honor guard moved forward again, each step resonating with the gravity of sacrifice. The sliding doors opened and cold air swept in, mingling with the warmth of reverence that filled the terminal. The hearse stood ready, its polished surface gleaming black as stone. Michael's voice, low but unwavering, broke the silence one final time. "Forward, to Arlington." And the people moved with him. The hearse outside gleamed like obsidian under the pale winter sun, but the transition from concourse to curb was not yet complete. Sergeant Michael Carter raised his hand subtly, commanding the honor guard to pause once more. His discipline made it seem deliberate, not hesitant, the kind of precision that lent weight to ritual. The casket rested steady, the flag pristine, each fold still sharp despite the countless eyes it had endured. For a long breath, the crowd remained frozen with it. Travelers clutched luggage but didn't move. A baby whimpered but was hushed instantly by her mother, who pressed her cheek against the child's hair as if shielding her from a world too heavy. The airport was transformed. The frantic pulse of departures and announcements had given way to a heartbeat measured by respect. But Richard Collins, the operations manager, stood at the edge of the path like a man watching his empire dissolve. His voice returned quieter but jagged. "Sergeant, this has gone far enough. The main corridor is shut down. Do you understand the chaos this causes?" Michael turned his head just slightly, his eyes cutting across Collins like a blade of glass. "You don't understand the chaos he died in. This isn't chaos. This is order, the only order that matters." The words struck harder than any raised tone could. Collins faltered, gripping his clipboard as though it were an anchor, but the authority in his voice no longer carried. His protest felt small against the immensity of the moment. Helen Ward stepped closer to the rope line, her voice carrying with a strength born from years of tending to soldiers on battlefields. "My son never asked for anything except to serve. And when he couldn't serve anymore, he asked one thing, that he be brought home right. Don't you dare stand in the way of that." The crowd murmured, emboldened. A young man in civilian clothes, his Marine Corps tattoo visible on his forearm, spoke up. "She's right. You can make schedules tomorrow. But today you make history." Collins's face flushed, but he no longer had words sharp enough to cut through. He fell back, his clipboard trembling in his grip, as though even he now understood the futility of arguing with duty. Michael's focus, however, never wavered from the casket. He allowed the silence to settle again, then commanded softly, "Forward." The pallbearers stepped in unison, their boots echoing in a rhythm that filled the concourse like a drumbeat of reverence. As they neared the doors, Sarah Martinez moved closer to Collins, lowering her voice. "Sir, sometimes leadership means knowing when to stop talking." He shot her a glare, but the weight of her words stayed with him. For once, he had no rebuttal. Michael's eyes flicked briefly toward Helen and Lily. The little girl still held her drawing, its crayon colors vivid against the somber tones around her. She clutched it like a lifeline, her gaze never leaving the stars on the flag. Grandma Lily whispered, "Can I give it to him now?" Helen's throat tightened. "Soon, sweetheart, when we reach the hearse." The crowd parted further instinctively, moving as one. A corridor of strangers had become a living testament, fathers lifting children to see business travelers dropping their phones to their sides. Even a janitor stepping back with mop in hand, his eyes damp. And then just as the honor guard reached the threshold, Collins snapped. He lunged forward, his hand reaching out desperately, not for the casket this time, but for control. "Enough," he shouted. "You can't shut down my terminal for a..." His words choked as Michael pivoted quicker than seemed possible in such a solemn procession. The sergeant's white-gloved hand rose not in violence but in an unmistakable gesture of warning. His voice thundered though it remained low. "You will not dishonor him." The hush that followed was absolute. Even Collins froze his chest, heaving the clipboard nearly slipping from his fingers. He saw it in Michael's eyes, restraint, fury, and the full weight of a promise stronger than any rule in a handbook. The silence broke, not with protest, but with the voice of George Roberts. The old veteran, his cap clutched over his heart, stepped forward. "Son, I carried men to choppers who never made it home. If I had seen one of those boys hidden away in a hallway, I'd have carried their memory like a wound. Let him walk. Let us see him. That's all we ask." The crowd stirred again, their murmurs gathering into quiet unity. Collins looked around, his isolation complete. Michael's voice came softer now, but just as commanding. "Step aside." And finally Collins did. The honor guard pressed forward. The sliding doors yawned open, cold air rushing in to meet them. Outside the hearse gleamed black, waiting to carry Ethan Ward to Arlington. The terminal, filled with people of every age and origin, stood still, heads bowed, hearts heavy. Some saluting, others pressing hands to their chests. Michael led the casket into the light, his every step an unbroken vow. The winter air rushed in sharper now, carrying the smell of jet fuel and cold tarmac. The honor guard advanced toward the waiting hearse, their steps a cadence that bound silence to every onlooker. Sergeant Michael Carter marched at the head, his eyes fixed forward, but every nerve inside him burned with the memory of Ethan Ward's laughter and the desert where the promise had been made. Behind the rope line, Helen Ward pulled Lily close. The child's drawing had begun to crumple in her small hands. The crayon colors smudged where her grip had grown too tight. She held it against her chest, as though it could reach her father through the wood and steel of the coffin. "Grandma," she whispered, "will Daddy see it if I put it on the flag?" Helen's throat ached. "Yes, baby, he'll see it." At that moment the casket tilted as the bearers slowed. Michael's hand rose, commanding another halt. His instincts told him the moment mattered. This pause was not a break in rhythm, but a recognition of something sacred. The crowd, sensing it, fell even deeper into stillness. No phones rose, no whispers stirred. Richard Collins, still lingering just behind, finally broke under the weight of silence. His voice cracked desperate. This is unsustainable. You're disrupting an international airport. There are laws, there are rules." Michael turned to him fully. This time his stare hard as stone. His voice emerged like a verdict. "There are laws older than your rules. This flag is one. This promise is one." Collins's lips trembled. "You can't just ignore protocol." Michael cut him off, his tone unwavering. "Protocol is what brought us here, but honor will take him home." The authority in Michael's voice left Collins reeling. The clipboard slipped from his hand, clattering onto the tile, but he didn't stoop to pick it up. His face, once flushed with self-assurance, now sagged with doubt and humiliation. It was then that Sarah Martinez stepped forward, her voice carrying more weight than rank. "Sir, look around you. No one's missing their flights. No one's angry. They're standing with him." Collins really looked for the first time. He saw businessmen with heads bowed, children pressed against their mothers, veterans saluting through tears, even airline workers lined up along the glass, their hands over their hearts. The terminal was not disrupted. It was transformed. Before Collins could respond, George Roberts spoke again, his voice carrying the gravel of years. "You're not in charge here, son. He is." He nodded toward Michael. "And more than that, he is." He gestured to the casket. "You just don't see it yet." Collins's chest rose and fell. For once, he had no reply. Michael pivoted back toward the hearse, raising his voice for the first time. "Forward." The bearers lifted the casket again, every step synchronized, every motion flawless. The flag rippled, catching the wind as the sliding doors fully opened. Outside, ground crew workers removed their caps, bowing their heads. A fuel truck driver paused mid-task, his hand finding his chest. Helen and Lily walked closer now, their presence allowed within the formation. Helen's eyes never left the casket, her lips moving silently in prayer. Lily clutched her drawing, trembling but determined. As they reached the final stretch of polished floor before the curb, Collins stumbled forward once more. His hand shaking rose toward the flag. "At least, let me help," he stammered. The gasp that rippled through the crowd was immediate. Michael spun his gloved hand, snapping forward, gripping Collins's wrist with unyielding force. His words cut sharper than any shout. "I told you twice, don't touch the flag." The silence following was deafening. Collins's knees nearly buckled. He looked into Michael's eyes and found no malice there, only the restrained fury of a man guarding something greater than himself. Michael released him slowly, deliberately, then stepped back into position, the casket still unbroken in its journey. Helen's voice broke the tension, trembling but strong. "My son carried this flag into battle. He died under it. The least you can do is let him rest under it with dignity." Lily lifted her drawing with both hands, tears streaking her cheeks. "This is for you, Daddy." The child's voice cracked the terminal open. Grown men wiped their faces. Women pressed tissues to their eyes. Even hardened travelers, pilots, businessmen, security guards, turned away, their shoulders shaking. Michael steadied himself, but inside Ethan's voice echoed again. "If I don't come back, Mike, make sure Mom knows I wanted it this way." And so Michael guided the honor guard to the threshold. The cold air whipped harder, carrying the scent of jet fuel and the sound of distant engines. The hearse waited, its back doors open like solemn arms. "Forward." Michael commanded one last time. The crowd parted wider, no longer strangers but united in reverence. The casket moved across the threshold, flag blazing against the winter light. And the nation represented in that single airport terminal bore witness. The pallbearers carried the casket with a precision that seemed carved from stone, their boots striking the pavement outside the terminal in perfect unison. The winter air bit at their cheeks, and the flag rippled like fire in the wind, but their grip never wavered. Sergeant Michael Carter marched ahead, shoulders square, the embodiment of a vow made in the dust of a battlefield. Helen Ward and her granddaughter Lily followed closely, the child's crayon drawing clutched against her chest. Helen's face was drawn tight, but her eyes blazed with a mixture of grief and pride. Every step felt like both a weight and a release, the last walk she would take behind her son before he was carried to Arlington. Behind them, the crowd had spilled out of the terminal. Hundreds of people, travelers, workers, veterans, children, stood in silence on the curb lining the path to the hearse. The chaos of the airport was gone. What remained was reverence. Richard Collins lingered at the doorway, his clipboard abandoned on the floor inside. His lips pressed into a thin line, his pride clashing with the undeniable force of what he had just witnessed. He wanted to speak to clawback authority, but his voice betrayed him. The crowd wasn't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the casket. Michael raised his hand, signaling the guard to halt just before the hearse. The pallbearers lowered the casket with precision, setting it on the stand prepared at the curb. The flag gleamed under the sun, each fold crisp, each star burning brighter than the winter sky. Helen stepped forward, pulling Lily beside her. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the flag, her fingertips brushing the cloth that now separated her from her son. "You kept your promise, Ethan," she whispered. "You came home right." Lily pressed her drawing against the flag. "This is for you, Daddy." The colors smudged faintly against the wind, but the paper clung there for a moment, caught in the folds of the stars and stripes. The sight broke something open in the crowd. Tears flowed freely, shoulders heaved with silent sobs, and even hardened men who had sworn they'd never cry in public turned away, hands trembling at their sides. Michael stepped closer, reaching into his uniform pocket. From it, he withdrew a photograph, creased, worn, nearly faded. It showed two young soldiers' arms thrown around each other, grinning under a desert moon. Michael placed the photo gently in Helen's hands. "For you," he said softly. "From the night we promised each other. He made me swear I'd bring him home right. And I did. Because of you, because of her." He nodded toward Lily. Helen's tears spilled, but she stood straighter, gripping the photo like a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered, "for keeping your word." The pallbearers lifted the casket once more and slid it carefully into the hearse. The thud of the doors closing echoed like a drumbeat across the curbside. Michael snapped into a salute, his white-gloved hand crisp against the brim of his cap. His arm locked steady, his body an unyielding pillar of respect. The crowd followed not in uniformity, but in sincerity. Some saluted, some pressed hands to their hearts, some simply bowed their heads. The hearse engine rumbled low and steady, but it did not move yet. It waited as if honoring the silence, and then came the moment that shifted everything. Richard Collins stepped forward. At last, his suit wrinkled, his expression cracked open. He stopped beside Michael, not daring to touch the flag, not even daring to meet the sergeant's eyes at first. His voice was barely audible, but the silence carried it to all. "I was wrong." His throat tightened. "I didn't understand." Michael lowered his salute, turning his head just slightly. He didn't speak, his silence was louder than any words. Collins's shoulders sagged. For the first time in his career, he realized there was no efficiency metric that could capture this. No percentage of on-time departures could measure what it meant to honor sacrifice. He bowed his head. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't military, but it was sincere. The hearse began to roll slowly forward, carrying Ethan Ward on his final journey to Arlington. Michael's arm rose again in a salute, unwavering until the black vehicle disappeared down the road. His body remained rigid, but his eyes burned with the weight of loss and the relief of a promise kept. The crowd didn't disperse immediately. They lingered as though unwilling to let go of the sacred silence that had settled over the airport. A businessman who had been rushing minutes before now stood with tears on his cheeks. A child saluted sloppily, mirroring Michael's stance, and Helen held Lily close, whispering words only the girl could hear. For a fleeting moment, the concourse, the curb, and the crowded heart of the airport had become something else entirely. Not a place of departure, but a place of remembrance. Michael exhaled slowly, lowering his hand. He turned, his uniform still immaculate, his posture still unbroken. Yet inside, he felt Ethan's voice one last time. "Thanks, brother. You did it right." Michael's jaw clenched. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply stood, as a tomb guard stood silent, steady, unyielding. And around him, strangers walked away carrying something they hadn't come to the airport to find the weight of honor. The hearse rolled forward slowly, its black body gleaming beneath the stark winter sun, escorted now not just by the honor guard, but by the silent weight of hundreds of strangers who had chosen reverence over convenience. The crowd lingered on the sidewalk, many still saluting, some clutching children, others simply standing still as if afraid to disturb the sacred air left in the procession's wake. Sergeant Michael Carter remained rigid, his salute unbroken until the vehicle disappeared around the curve of the departure loop. Only when the last glint of sunlight faded from its polished surface did he lower his arm. His breath came steady but deep inside his chest. Something shook, something he refused to let show. A tomb guard never wavered. A tomb guard never broke. Helen Ward leaned against the rope line, her shoulders trembling as she clutched the worn photograph Michael had given her. She stared at it, two grinning boys under desert stars, until tears blurred the edges. Lily tugged her sleeve, whispering, "Grandma did?" "Daddy smiled like that all the time." Helen bent down, kissing the child's forehead. "Most of the time," she said softly. "Especially when he talked about you." Lily pressed her crayon drawing tighter against her chest. "Then I'm glad he has this now." Behind them, the crowd began to shift. A businessman wiped his eyes with the corner of his sleeve before quietly gathering his things. A mother whispered to her curious child about sacrifice. An airline worker lingered, staring at the flag as if memorizing it. For once, the terminal moved not with impatience, but with solemnity. Richard Collins stood a few steps away, his shoulders rounded, his clipboard abandoned inside. The suit that once gave him authority now felt like a costume. His lips moved as if searching for words, but only fragments emerged. I didn't see it. Not until now." Sarah Martinez approached him, her radio still untouched at her belt. Her voice was low but firm. "You didn't want to see. There's a difference." Collins looked at her, then at Michael, who still stood at attention as if the hearse were visible miles down the road. The sergeant's unwavering composure shamed him more than any public rebuke. Collins exhaled, his voice breaking. "How do you come back from this? How do you make it right?" Sarah's eyes flicked toward the flag, then back at him. "You don't fix it with words. You fix it by never making the same mistake again." Michael finally turned, his gaze settling on Collins. He didn't speak. His silence was damning enough, but the hardness in his eyes carried a message clear as any order. Some things can't be measured in timetables. The sound of the hearse engine had faded, but the hush remained. It was as if the entire airport had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Travelers still lined the corridor, reluctant to move. The spell was not yet broken. George Roberts, the Vietnam veteran, stepped forward again. His salute lowered slowly, and he placed his faded ribbon into Helen's palm. For him, he said simply, "And for you." Helen's fingers closed around it. She nodded once, unable to speak. Michael pivoted sharply, his boots striking the pavement in precision. He gave the honor guard their final command to dismiss. The soldiers obeyed, their movements still flawless, but their eyes carried the same weight as the crowds. They had all been changed by this moment. As the formation broke, Michael lingered staring at the path where the hearse had gone. His mind slipped back again to Afghanistan, the laughter, the ambush, the promise beneath desert stars. Ethan's voice rang in his memory, teasing and solemn. "All at once. Don't let them sneak me out the back. Bring me through the front, Mike. Promise me." He had kept that promise. At a cost, yes, but promises worth keeping always carried cost. Helen approached him, Lily clinging to her hand. Her voice shook, but it carried strength. "You gave my son the honor he deserved. You gave Lily a memory that will never fade." "I don't know how to thank you." Michael met her eyes. His face remained composed, but his voice softened. "You already did. You raised him." Helen's tears returned. She gripped his hand firm despite her age. "You kept your word. That matters more than anything." Lily stepped forward, her small hand brushing Michael's glove. "Thank you for bringing my daddy home." For a moment, Michael felt something crack inside him. He swallowed hard, forced his jaw tight, and nodded once. He couldn't afford more. Not here. Not now. Behind them, the terminal buzz began to return faintly. A boarding announcement, softer this time, echoed through the glass. Life resumed as it always did. But the people who had witnessed the procession walked with a new weight, carrying something intangible, yet undeniable. Michael turned back toward the terminal doors. Duty still awaited him. His post at Arlington, his silent vigil at the tomb of the unknown soldier, demanded his return. But as he stepped inside, the crowd parted again, not with urgency, but with deference. They knew, they had seen, and for the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to feel the faintest trace of relief. Ethan was home. The promise was kept. The heavy doors whispered shut behind them, muting the cold tarmac air. Inside, the terminal felt changed, though nothing had moved. The screens still scrolled their flights. The announcement still hummed overhead. Luggage wheels still rattled against tile. Yet an invisible current ran through the space, one born of silence and sacrifice. People moved more carefully. Voices dropped low, and every glance seemed drawn to Sergeant Michael Carter, the tomb guard, whose presence had transformed an ordinary afternoon into something unforgettable. Michael's boots struck the polished floor in steady rhythm. His uniform was still immaculate, his posture rigid, but the storm within him churned. He had guided Ethan Ward through the front, through the gaze of strangers who now carried pieces of the promise in their hearts. He had kept his word, yet the weight of it pressed heavy against his chest as though the promise wasn't finished. Helen Ward walked beside him, her fingers wrapped around the creased photograph of Ethan and Michael in their youth. Lily skipped one half step behind her drawing, now folded neatly in Helen's purse, safe beside the ribbon George Roberts had given. The child looked up at Michael with wide eyes, studying him as though trying to memorize every detail, the glint of the badge on his chest, the stern line of his jaw, the way he moved as though every step carried meaning. "Are you going back to Daddy's tomb?" she asked suddenly, her voice ringing out in the hush. Michael slowed just slightly, turning his head toward her. "To the tomb I guard." "Yes," he said gently, "but your daddy has his own place now. Arlington will be his." Lily nodded solemnly, though her lip quivered. "Will you watch him too?" The question struck Michael harder than any confrontation with Collins had. He crouched down just enough to meet her eyes. "I can't stand beside him all the time. But I promise you this, he'll never be forgotten. Not by me. Not by anyone who saw today." The girl's tears spilled. She lunged forward and hugged him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Michael stiffened, then slowly placed a white-gloved hand against her back, careful as though she were made of glass. He held her only for a moment, then eased back, his face composed once again. Helen's lips trembled as she watched. He would be proud, she whispered. Michael stood tall again, giving her a single respectful nod. He wanted to say more, to tell her that Ethan's laughter still lived in his memory, that his friend's courage still guided his every step. But words failed him. Instead, he gave the one gesture he knew could carry the weight of all that remained unsaid. He straightened heels, clicking, and saluted. Helen gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. She bowed her head, tears falling freely, and placed her hand over her heart. Lily mimicked the gesture, standing on tiptoe, as though trying to make herself taller. Around them, travelers stopped again. The simple act of a salute done with flawless precision in the heart of a busy terminal froze the rush of ordinary life. Some saluted too. Others pressed their palms to their chests, and a new silence spread, as if the earlier corridor of honor had never ended, only shifted. Richard Collins watched from a distance, half hidden behind a column. His pride had been stripped raw, leaving only regret. The authority he had clung to had meant nothing. What endured was this one soldier saluting another, one family carrying memory, one airport transformed by reverence. He took a step forward, then stopped. His voice carried only to himself, "I didn't understand. God forgive me." He lowered his head, shame burning hotter than anger ever had. Michael lowered his salute at last. He turned, his boots echoing again as he resumed his march through the terminal. The crowd, without instruction, parted in silence to let him pass. Helen and Lily followed until the path forked, one way leading back toward the concourse, the other toward the exit where their ride waited. Helen paused, her hand tightening on Michael's arm. "Thank you," she whispered again. "Not just for today. For everything. For keeping him alive in the way that matters." Michael inclined his head once sharply. "It was my duty and my honor." They separated then, Helen and Lily heading toward the exit. Michael continuing deeper into the terminal. But though their paths diverged, the bond of the promise still bound them together. The hum of the airport returned in fragments, boarding calls, rolling bags, muffled conversations, but none of it drowned the echo of what had just happened. Travelers dispersed, but slower than before, their faces reflective. A mother explained sacrifice to her curious son. A businessman wiped his cheeks before answering a work call. A group of teenagers whispered about what it meant to stand still for something greater than themselves. Michael reached a quiet alcove near the terminal's end. He paused, adjusting the gloves on his hands, then drew a slow breath. His duty here was finished. But as he turned toward the exit that would carry him back to Arlington, the promise still pulsed in his chest like a heartbeat. He had brought Ethan home. Now he would return to his post to guard the unknown, to honor the unseen, to keep watch for every soldier whose name was carried in silence. The airport had witnessed one man's promise. Arlington would continue the vigil. The drive back to Arlington was quiet, the hum of the vehicle blending with the low murmur of traffic beyond the windows. Sergeant Michael Carter sat in the rear seat of the government sedan, his hands folded in his lap, white gloves resting against the sharp crease of his trousers. Through the tinted glass, the world slid past in shades of gray and cold winter light. His mind, however, was still on the terminal. The faces, every bowed head, every trembling salute, every tear shed by strangers who hadn't known Ethan Ward played through his thoughts. He had fulfilled his vow, yet the weight of it had not lessened. If anything, it pressed heavier. Promises like Ethan's were never simple tasks completed. They became anchors binding one life to another long after death. Michael closed his eyes. The desert returned again, the heat, the dust, the smell of burned powder. He heard Ethan's laughter in the barracks, saw him tossing a ball made from duct tape and socks, heard his voice tease, "You think too much, Mike. Just live." Then the ambush, the tackle, the blood. Ethan's grin dimmed, but not gone, whispering through grit teeth, "Bring me home, right?" The car slowed, jarring him back. The driver glanced into the mirror. "We're nearly there, Sergeant." Michael gave a small nod. His throat was tight, but his posture never faltered. Outside, the familiar stone and manicured grounds of Arlington rose into view, solemn and eternal. When the vehicle stopped, Michael stepped out, boots striking the pavement in crisp rhythm. Cold air bit his face, but he welcomed it. The cemetery stretched before him, rows upon rows of white headstones standing like silent sentinels. He inhaled deeply, the weight of the place settling over him like a cloak. He walked alone now, his gloves clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the endless expanse of sacrifice. He felt the pull of his own post, the tomb of the unknown soldier, where he would resume his watch. But first he allowed himself to pause. He stood at the edge of a hill where the wind carried faint echoes of the city beyond. Below him, the line of the hearse had just arrived, pulling gently onto the road that would lead Ethan to his final rest. Michael's chest tightened. He wanted to follow to see it through, but his duty here demanded otherwise. He closed his eyes again, listening. In the silence, he thought he could hear it, the sound of Ethan's laugh carried on the wind, the same laugh that had lifted him through 3 tours, and beneath it the whispered words of promise. No back halls. Mike, full honors. Michael's jaw set. He had kept that promise. Ethan was home. Voices carried behind him. Tourists unaware of what had just unfolded at the airport murmured as they approached the tomb of the unknown soldier. Michael straightened, sliding back into the posture of his role. To them, he was simply the sentinel they expected to see, perfect, precise, unbroken. They would not know the story that burned inside him. They would only see the uniform, the ritual, the silence. But perhaps that was enough. He stepped forward, the cadence of 21 paces already in his mind. Left heel down, right heel snapping in rifle at his shoulder. 21 seconds of pause, then the turn, then 21 steps again. A dance of honor that had outlasted wars, outlasted generations, and would outlast him. As he took his position, the words he had spoken in the airport echoed back. Honor is always sustainable. He believed it more now than ever, because honor was not an event. It was a way of living. Far away, Helen Ward laid her hand on the flag that covered her son's casket. Lily placed her drawing on top before the honor guard folded the flag with perfect precision. They would not see Michael standing watch that night, but they would feel him. They would know that somewhere a soldier still kept vigil, still guarded promises too heavy for any one family to bear. And Michael, as he began his first turn of the night under the Arlington sky, let himself whisper words meant only for the silence. Rest easy, Ethan. I'll take it from here. The wind carried the vow away, but the stone, the tomb, and the endless rows of names absorbed it, preserving it as surely as history itself. For Ethan Ward, for Helen, for Lily, for every soldier who never made it home. Michael marched on. Night settled over Arlington with a quiet weight, the kind of stillness that made even the wind sound reverent. Under the pale glow of floodlights, Sergeant Michael Carter resumed his eternal duty. His rifle balanced on his shoulder, his steps measured with perfect precision, 21 paces, 21 seconds, the solemn ritual repeated without flaw. His boots struck the marble walkway with a rhythm as old as the post itself. But though his body moved in ritual, Michael's mind remained with Ethan. Every turn carried him back through memories. He pictured Ethan's crooked grin when they first met in training, the way he would crack jokes to cut through the monotony. He remembered the night they'd sat under desert stars, shoulders pressed together, talking about families back home. Ethan had spoken about Lily then, just a toddler, and about Helen, the mother who had taught him resilience. If I don't make it, Mike, make sure they know I mattered. Ethan had said softly, his voice stripped of bravado. Michael's throat tightened as he paced. Today, in the middle of an airport where people rushed for flights and managers counted minutes, Ethan had mattered. He had been seen. He had been honored. The vow was kept. At the far end of his march, Michael pivoted sharply. Heels, clicking eyes, fixed forward. A small group of visitors stood behind the chains that marked the viewing line. They whispered to one another, hushed by the gravity of what they saw. A child tried to count Michael's steps on his fingers. A veteran in a wheelchair saluted, tears on his cheeks. They didn't know Ethan's name, but they felt him in the ritual, in the silence, in the steadfast presence of the guard, who never broke. Michael felt the burn in his calves, the ache in his shoulders, but he didn't flinch. Pain was irrelevant here. At the tomb, the body didn't belong to the man, it belonged to the duty. And yet tonight was different. Tonight every step felt doubled, as though he carried Ethan alongside the unknown. Back in the city, Helen and Lily were settling into a hotel arranged by the army. Helen sat at the edge of the bed, the folded flag on her lap, Lily asleep beside her with the photograph Michael had given her clutched to her chest. Helen brushed her granddaughter's hair, whispering promises of her own, that Lily would grow up knowing who her father had been, that she would carry his memory not as a wound, but as a light. The ribbon George Roberts had given them lay on the nightstand, frayed but proud. Helen touched it gently, recognizing in that simple scrap the continuity of sacrifice across generations. Meanwhile, in his office at the airport, Richard Collins sat slumped at his desk, the abandoned clipboard shoved to one side. The certificates of efficiency on the wall mocked him now. For years he had measured success in numbers, percentages of on-time departures, minutes saved, dollars earned. But today none of it had mattered. Today he had been taught a lesson by a soldier who spoke only when it mattered, and by a mother and child who demanded nothing but dignity. His assistant Sarah knocked softly on the doorframe. Collins lifted his head, his eyes weary. "I failed them," he muttered. Sarah didn't argue. She stepped into the office and set a folded paper on his desk, a copy of the crayon drawing Lily had left with her father. One of the airline staff had quietly made it, wanting Collins to see what he had nearly erased. Maybe Sarah said gently, "You can start by remembering him." Collins stared at the drawing for a long time. For the first time in years, he felt small in a way that wasn't humiliating but necessary. Back at Arlington, Michael reached the 21st step. He paused, rifle at his shoulder, his face carved from marble. The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of pine and stone. He closed his eyes for the briefest moment, whispering inside his mind, words he couldn't speak aloud. "We brought you home, Ethan. You'll never be hidden. Not while I still walk." He opened his eyes, pivoted sharply, and began the march again. Somewhere beyond the marble and the lights, a nation carried on. Flights departed. Cars honked. Lives hurried forward. But here in this place, time stood still. And because of that, promises endured. The dawn broke pale and cold over Arlington, the sky painted in muted shades of lavender and gray. Frost clung to the grass between the rows of white marble headstones, each one catching the first light like a quiet flame. Sergeant Michael Carter had stood his post through the long hours of the night, every step measured, every turn precise. His body ached from the vigil, but his face betrayed nothing. To the handful of early visitors gathered near the tomb of the unknown soldier, he was not a man, but a sentinel, unyielding, eternal. Yet as Michael pivoted and began another set of 21 paces, the events of the day before lingered with him as vivid as the stars that had burned over Afghanistan. He remembered the hush that fell over the airport, the way the crowd had transformed into a living corridor of honor, the look in Helen Ward's eyes as she touched the flag for the last time. He could still hear Lily's small voice trembling but clear. "That's my daddy's flag. Don't hide him." Those words had pierced through noise and bureaucracy alike. They had turned an ordinary terminal into sacred ground, and they had reminded Michael of the weight every soldier bore, not just for themselves, but for the families who would carry their memory. As he reached the edge of his path, Michael pivoted sharply again, the rifle balanced perfectly on his shoulder. A small group of school children pressed against the viewing rail, their teacher whispering instructions to be silent. One boy raised his hand as though in class, whispering, "Why doesn't he stop?" Another child answered softly, "Because he's not allowed to." Michael heard them. He always heard. But he did not break stride. Instead, he let the silence answer for him. Beyond Arlington's gates, the hearse carrying Ethan Ward had arrived at the chapel where his service would be held later that morning. Helen sat in the front row, the folded flag resting in her lap. Lily sat beside her, her little hands folded tightly around the drawing she had given her father, as though afraid it would vanish if she let go. The room filled slowly with soldiers, veterans, friends, and neighbors, each carrying their own memories of Ethan. George Roberts, the Vietnam veteran from the airport, entered quietly and found a seat in the back. He hadn't known Ethan in life, but he felt bound to him now, bound to the family, by the ribbon he had given Helen and by the promise he had seen fulfilled with his own eyes. He whispered a prayer under his breath. "Rest easy, brother. You're home." At the airport, meanwhile, Richard Collins sat in his office long after his shift had ended. The clipboard lay untouched on the desk, the efficiency charts meaningless in the wake of what he had witnessed. His assistant Sarah stood in the doorway watching him wrestle with his conscience. "You don't have to carry this like a wound," she said softly, "but you should carry it like a lesson." Collins looked up. His eyes tired, his voice stripped of arrogance. "I thought numbers kept us moving forward, but yesterday showed me what really matters. He wasn't a number, he was a promise." He lowered his gaze again, and I nearly broke it. Sarah stepped closer, laying a hand gently on his desk. "Then make sure you never let it happen again." Collins nodded, the words searing into him like a brand. For the first time, he felt the stirrings of humility, something no meeting or performance metric had ever taught him. Back at Arlington, Michael felt the sun break over the horizon, warming the marble beneath his feet. He marched, turned, paused, marched again. Each movement was flawless, the product of endless training. Yet today, each step felt personal. Today, the unknowns he guarded stood shoulder to shoulder with Ethan in his mind. Today, his march was not just ritual, but remembrance. As he reached the 21st step, he paused and let his eyes sweep across the endless rows of headstones. To most, they were markers of strangers. To him, they were reminders of promises made and kept. His voice remained locked inside, but in his heart, he whispered words meant for one man alone. "You're home, Ethan." I kept my word. The wind carried across the stones, whispering through the bare trees like a chorus, and Michael, resuming his march, felt the weight of duty settle deeper into him, not as a burden, but as a calling that would never fade. The chapel at Arlington filled slowly, the hush of footsteps on marble, blending with the faint rustle of uniforms and coats. Rows of pews stood polished, their wooden backs lined with programs that bore Ethan Ward's name and photograph. The flag outside stirred in the winter air, snapping softly against the mast. Inside, the air was heavy with the mingling scents of waxed wood and the faint perfume of lilies arranged near the altar. Helen Ward sat in the front pew, the folded flag still in her lap. Her hands trembled against the fabric as though afraid to let go. Beside her, Lily perched on the edge of the seat, the crayon drawing she had once pressed to the casket, now carefully folded inside her pocket. She kept reaching down to touch it, reassuring herself it was still there. When the organ began to play, the sound rolled through the chapel like a tide. The congregation rose as the honor guard entered, their white gloves gleaming, their rifles held in ceremonial position. At their center, Sergeant Michael Carter marched in step, his face composed, his uniform flawless. He carried no words with him, only the gravity of his presence, the silent echo of the promise he had kept. Michael took his place at the front, standing sentinel once more. His eyes fixed forward, but he felt the gaze of the family behind him. He could sense Helen's grief pressing against his back like a physical weight, could almost hear Lily's soft breaths as she tried to be brave. He stood as their shield, as he had promised Ethan he would. The chaplain spoke words of comfort, of sacrifice and duty, of the eternal bond between a soldier and the nation he served. Each phrase washed over Michael like water on stone. He had heard such words before in other services in other places, but this time they struck differently. This time they wrapped around a promise carved in fire under desert skies. Helen rose when it was her turn to speak. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she began. "Ethan wasn't just my son. He was my light. He loved baseball, he loved to laugh, and he loved this country enough to give everything for it. I sent my husband to war years ago, and then my son. Both times I prayed I wouldn't have to sit in a place like this. But here I am." Her throat tightened and she pressed a hand against the folded flag. "And yet I'm proud. Because Ethan died protecting his brothers. He died as he lived selfless and brave." Lily tugged at Helen's hand, whispering something. Helen nodded and lifted her up onto the lectern. The girl's voice was small but clear. "My daddy said he'd always come back. And he did. He's here now. And he has my drawing." The chapel fell into silence, broken only by muffled sobs. A decorated colonel in the second row pressed a hand against his eyes. A young soldier bowed his head so low his cap nearly fell off. Michael's chest constricted, but his face remained impassive. He remembered Ethan's laughter again, how it could cut through fear like sunlight breaking storm clouds. And he remembered the ambush, the dust, the desperate promise. It all lived in this moment, in the voice of a little girl who had turned grief into truth. Her father had come home. When the service ended, the pallbearers lifted Ethan's casket one final time and carried it outside. The winter air was sharp, the sky an unbroken blue. The crowd followed their steps, muffled on the stone. At the gravesite, the ritual unfolded with the precision of centuries. The casket was lowered, the rifles fired 3 times, the bugler's trumpet cut the air with taps. The sound lingered haunting and holy, each note a thread tying past to present. Michael stood at rigid attention, his salute unwavering as the flag was folded with flawless care. When it was complete, the officer in charge presented it to Helen. Her hands trembled as she received it, pressing it to her chest as though it were Ethan himself. Then she turned her eyes, finding Michael. She stepped forward, holding out the ribbon George Roberts had given her. "He wanted you to have this," she whispered, "to remind you that promises carry through generations." Michael looked at the frayed ribbon, the symbol of another war, another vow kept. Slowly, he took it in his white-gloved hand and nodded once. His voice came low, steady. "I'll carry it." Helen's tears broke again, but she smiled through them. As the crowd dispersed, Michael remained. The headstones stretched in every direction, silent witnesses to sacrifice. The cold wind brushed against his cheek, carrying faint echoes of laughter that no one else could hear. He whispered, barely audible, "Rest easy, Ethan. You're home." Then he turned sharply, heels striking stone, and marched back toward his post. His steps were steady, his shoulders squared, his promise complete, but his vigil eternal. The sky over Arlington shifted from blue to gold as the afternoon sun lowered, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. The grounds had quieted again. The service was over, the family escorted back to their lodging, and the crowd dispersed to their lives beyond the gates. Only the guards, the stone, and the silence remained. Sergeant Michael Carter walked alone now, his boots crunching against the gravel path. In his hand, tucked carefully into his glove, was the frayed ribbon Helen had given him, a scrap of fabric worn with age, yet weighted with meaning. He turned it once between his fingers, studying the threads. It was fragile, but it carried strength. It had survived battles and time, and now it rested with him. He paused at the hill overlooking the section where Ethan Ward had been laid to rest. The fresh earth still bore the scars of the burial, the flag that had once draped the casket, now folded into Helen's trembling arms. Michael stood in silence, his chest tight. The promise was fulfilled, but a promise fulfilled did not erase the loss. He heard footsteps behind him. George Roberts, the Vietnam veteran, had not yet left. His cap was in his hand, his gaze fixed on Ethan's grave. "You stood tall, son," he said, his voice carrying the gravel of age and memory. "He would have been proud." Michael inclined his head, still facing forward. He deserved no less. George stepped beside him, studying the expanse of stones. "We carry them, you know, all of them. Some in memory, some in guilt. But carrying is what we do. And you," he gestured at Michael's badge, "you carry for all of us. Never forget that." Michael turned slightly, the ribbon still in his hand. "I won't." George's weathered face softened. "Then you're already doing what matters most." He replaced his cap and walked away, leaving Michael alone with the silence. As twilight deepened, Michael returned to the tomb of the unknown soldier. Tourists had gone. The gates were quieter, but his watch was not yet finished. He prepared himself, adjusting his gloves, checking his rifle, centering his mind. Each detail mattered. Each step was part of the eternal vow. When he began his march, the cadence echoed against the stone. 21 paces. Pause. Turn. 21 paces again. His movements were flawless, the product of endless training. Yet tonight, with Ethan's memory pressing against his heart, every step carried more than ritual. Each stride felt like a continuation of the journey that had begun in the airport, carried through the chapel, and ended at the graveside. The ribbon weighed in his pocket. He imagined Helen's hand pressing it into his palm, her words ringing clear. Promises carry through generations. Michael's eyes remained fixed forward, but inside he spoke the words he could never voice aloud. "I carried him home. I'll carry the rest too." Far beyond the cemetery, Richard Collins sat in his quiet office. The airport bustled as it always did, planes arriving, planes departing, but the day before clung to him like a shadow. He stared at the crayon drawing pinned to his wall, the copy Sarah had given him. For once, he had no appetite for numbers, no interest in the schedule. His pen hovered over his notepad, then scratched a few words, honor, before efficiency. He didn't know if it would last, but he needed to remember. Back at Arlington, Michael marched on. The night descended fully, the stars rising one by one. Their cold light shimmered across the marble, reflecting in his steady eyes. He thought again of Ethan's laughter, of his reckless courage, of the promise under desert skies. And as he turned at his 21st step, his voice rose just loud enough to break the silence. Never forgotten. No one else heard, but the stones did. The earth did. And the tomb bore witness. The winter night wrapped Arlington in a solemn stillness, the grounds glistening faintly under a thin sheen of frost. Floodlights cast long shadows across the white headstones, their rows endless, their silence unbroken. At the heart of it all, Sergeant Michael Carter continued his vigil at the tomb of the unknown soldier. His steps were tireless, his rifle steady, his cadence exact. To the handful of visitors who had braved the cold evening, he seemed less like a man and more like a monument carved into motion. But inside, Michael was still carrying Ethan. Each 21 paces became an echo of their bond. Each pause a memory replayed. He thought of their banter during training, Ethan's grin breaking through exhaustion, of the ambush in Afghanistan when Ethan's body had shielded his own, of the night beneath desert stars when a promise had been forged. Every detail burned clear in the cold air, stitched into the silence like thread into cloth. In the distance, Helen Ward lay awake in her hotel room, the folded flag still resting against her chest. The room was dark, except for a sliver of light spilling through the curtains. Lily slept beside her, her small hand curled around the photograph Michael had given them. Helen brushed a strand of hair from her granddaughter's face, whispering softly, "He's home, baby. He's finally home." Her voice cracked, but there was pride beneath the grief. The same pride that had carried her through years of service as a nurse and now as a mother of the fallen. Back at the airport, Richard Collins remained at his desk, though the terminal had long since quieted. He stared at the copy of Lily's drawing pinned to the wall. For years he had worshipped the god of schedules, worshipped numbers and charts that measured efficiency. But now whenever he tried to calculate, his mind returned to the look in Helen's eyes, to the silence of the crowd, to the sergeant's warning, "You don't touch the flag." The words haunted him, reshaping him. For the first time in his career, he wanted to do more than maintain order. He wanted to honor it. At Arlington, Michael marched on. His boots struck marble with perfect rhythm. 21 steps, pause, turn. The sound carried across the grounds like a heartbeat. With each pause, his eyes swept across the endless markers, a sea of sacrifice. He let the silence press against him, let the cold cut deep, let the memory of Ethan remind him why he stood here at all. A faint shuffle broke his concentration. Near the viewing rail, an old man in a heavy coat stood alone, cap in his hands. Michael didn't look directly at him. Protocol demanded focus, but he noticed the man's trembling salute. It was not sharp, not perfect, but it was real. And Michael felt a surge of kinship. Veterans, families, guards, they were all part of the same unbroken chain. When the old man lowered his hand, his lips moved. Michael couldn't hear the words, but he could guess them. "Thank you." Michael turned sharply, his rifle gleaming under the floodlights, and resumed his paces. The ritual consumed him, stripped him of self, made him into the embodiment of duty. Yet inside his thoughts, whispered like a prayer, "Ethan, you're home, and I will walk for you until I can walk no more." The hours passed, the night deepened, the frost thickened. Still, he did not falter. In the hotel room, Helen finally drifted into sleep, the folded flag against her heart, her granddaughter pressed against her side. In the airport office, Collins closed his eyes at his desk, humbled into reflection. And in Arlington, Michael Carter continued his eternal vigil, one promise kept countless others still carried. The nation moved on as it always did. Planes took off. Cars roared down highways. People hurried through their lives. But here in this place, time bent around silence and sacrifice, and Michael, guarding both the unknown and the remembered, whispered again into the cold never forgotten. The first light of dawn crept over Arlington, spilling soft gold across the marble stones. Frost glittered on the grass like thousands of tiny stars, and the silence of the cemetery was broken only by the measured cadence of boots striking stone. Sergeant Michael Carter's vigil stretched into another day, his shoulders square, his rifle sharp against his frame, his pace flawless. But this morning, something felt different. The air itself seemed to carry yesterday's echoes, the hush of the airport, Helen Ward's trembling voice, Lily's whisper of, "That's my daddy's flag." The memory of that sacred corridor of strangers lingered as though every bowed head, every tear, every salute had been folded into Michael's uniform alongside the badge of a tomb guard. He reached his 21st step and pivoted sharply. His eyes swept forward, but inside he saw Ethan again. He saw him laughing in the barracks, tossing that duct tape ball. He saw him bleeding in the dirt, still grinning through pain, and he heard his voice as clear as the wind in the trees. "If I don't come back, Mike, bring me home right." Michael had done it. The promise was fulfilled, yet duty did not end with one vow. It lived on as eternal as the tomb he guarded. Beyond the cemetery walls, Helen and Lily stood quietly at Ethan's fresh grave. Helen's hand rested on the folded flag, her granddaughter's drawing tucked safely beneath it. Lily placed a daisy on the soil, whispering, "I love you, Daddy." Helen's tears fell silently, but her voice carried a strength Ethan had left in her. "We'll be all right," she said softly, "because you gave us more than we could ever give back." At the airport, Richard Collins arrived early. He paused at his office door, staring at the certificates he once prized. They looked hollow now. His eyes shifted to the crayon drawing pinned on the wall. Slowly, he removed the awards from their frames and set them aside. The drawing remained centered a new standard. He whispered to himself honor before efficiency, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of humility settle into purpose. Back at Arlington, Michael continued his march. Tourists gathered at the rail, their chatter fading as they watched the guard's perfection. They didn't know the story of Ethan Ward, didn't know about the airport standoff or the vow kept. But they felt it all the same in the ritual, in the silence, in the unbroken steps. As Michael paused at the 21st second, the sun broke free of the horizon. Its light struck the marble, igniting it with brilliance. The tomb glowed eternal, unyielding. Michael whispered into the cold air so quietly that only the stones could hear. "Rest easy, Ethan. Rest easy, all of you. I'll carry the watch." He turned, resumed his pace, the cadence echoing into the morning. And though the world outside would rush again with schedules and departures, inside Arlington time moved differently. Here sacrifice was remembered, promises endured, and silence spoke louder than any words. Michael's figure cut across the marble path, precise and unyielding. He was one man, but behind him stood centuries of duty. Behind him stood Ethan. Behind him stood every soldier who never came home. The tomb guard marched on. If you like the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more similar stories. Now click on the video on the screen to hear another story that is equally powerful and compelling, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that makes you question everything you know about duty and justice. Click on the video.